Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to an FS Club ESOP Centre webinar with me, Ian Harris. I'll be the chairman today, and I'm delighted to introduce once again David Craddock, who is the founder and director of David Craddock Consultancy Services. And for those of you who are regular attendees of these things, as you know, I love introducing David as an expert on a subject because he really is an expert on the subject of employee share ownership schemes, to such an extent that he is the man who wrote the book, The Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Schemes, and a jolly good book, the book on that topic it is too. I'm actually personally fascinated with today's talk and discussion because it's a subject that's been on my mind for many years, which is the notion of having share schemes for non-employees. And this is very topical at the moment, I think, with the gig economy being an increasingly large part of the working environment. But back in the day when we set up Zien in the mid 1990s, our model was very much based on a mixture of employees and associates, and we were intrigued by the idea of being able to enable employees and associates who were not employees to participate in equity if they wanted to. So this is an interesting and, I believe, very topical subject. You're hearing from me, a bit dour in that picture. We are very grateful to the sponsors of the FS Club and the ESOP Centre for enabling us to do this program of webinars. We wouldn't be able to do it without their forbearance and generosity. And in front of you here is a list of the FS Club sponsors in all of their glory. It's a long list of wonderful organisations, all of whom participate and help us in this program. And very specifically with the ESOP Centre, this group of organisations are the sponsors, members of the ESOP Centre. And we're extremely grateful to all of these organisations for enabling us to put on this program of interesting webinars. Today's agenda is quite straightforward. Hopefully I'm not using up all of my 5 minutes to introduce David. Might be getting close now. David's going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we will have questions and answers afterwards. And certainly it's been a feature of David's, indeed most of our webinars, but particularly David's, that we get some very interesting questions, and the discussion at the end of the webinar is a very valuable part of the afternoon. You will see on your panel that you have a questions button that you can press in order to ask your question. Please use the GoToWebinar questions panel to send your questions to us. Fascinating as it is to receive emails or texts from people who know us, we are sort of locked into this webinar chamber, this particular part of the metaverse. We are locked in for the minutes that we're with you. So we don't see anything outside it, but we do see the questions that you ask here. So please ask them in this environment, and we will endeavour to answer all David will endeavour to answer all the questions during the webinar. If we have so many that we can't answer them all, we pass on all the questions to David, and he will endeavour to answer them to you privately. So it really is worth asking the questions if you have them. So I've already told you who today's speaker is. Without further ado, let me hand you over to Mr. David Craddock.
Right, thank you, Ian. I know that there's a lot of interest in this particular webinar. I think it's the 11th in the series that we've done since the ESOP Centre combined with the FS Club. And I've had some very interesting feedback already on the sort of things that people want to see addressed through this presentation. It's a subject about economics. It's a subject about business psychology. It's a subject about the interaction between economics and business psychology, both at an individual level and at a corporate level and at a national level. So let's get into the detail of the subject. I've tried to address questions through these slides, and those of you who have attended my webinars before know that my approach is to include a lot of detail on the slides. The reason why I do that is to enable you to have notes, detailed notes on what I've said. It gives you the opportunity to go back over the notes and hold them for future reference within your practices and within your businesses. And if anything comes up that's of interest to you, do contact me. You can get my email address from the slides as well. So this first key question: what is the gig economy in the UK? I'm focusing here on the UK for the duration of this presentation. I pulled out to start with a number of definitions. It's always a good place to start. Define your terms, yes? A definition which was publicised by the BBC for a documentary on the gig economy. The gig economy is a labour market, we know that, characterised by the prevalence of short-term or freelance work as opposed to permanent jobs. It is work that does not have the characteristics of employment, such as pension arrangements or holiday pay or sick pay. So it's temporary job type arrangement. It's short-term. And it doesn't have what in tax terms, for tax law, we call the aggregate of factors to determine employment. In fact, the aggregate of factors determine the very reverse, that it's not employment. It is definitively not employment. I've then identified the second definition for you, which was produced by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the BEIS of the British government, jointly with the Institute of Employment Studies. The gig economy involves the exchange of labour for money between individuals or companies via digital platforms that actively facilitate matching between providers and customers on a short-term and payment by task basis. Two key things to pick out there actually is short-term and payment by task. That's a very, very interesting phrase indeed. So it's not payment by time involved in the job, it's payment by task, which is actually accomplished. And the other thing which I'd want to pull out of that definition actually is that not always, but very often, the operation of the gig economy is actually supported by a digital platform, yes, a technological platform which assists the communication between the individuals and the companies, the customers or the suppliers. And then I've taken this final definition taken from the Gig Economy Statistics UK 2021 Industry Report. The gig economy is a large and growing section of the working population where short-term flexible workers are paid on completion of tasks known as gigs. This term gig, of course, comes from the entertainment world. The gig, where you go and see your favourite band play in Earl's Court or the Albert Hall or somewhere, instead of being paid for the amount of time they work. So it's reiterating the points in the previous definitions. Let's go then to the next slide. That last definition says the gig economy is large. Well, let's just have a look at how large it is. So these are some key statistics which support the presentation for today. So based on historic figures and 2022 demographic projection figures from the UK Office of National Statistics, in 2016 there were 2.3 gig workers in the UK, which is a very large number. It really is. By 2019, 4.7. So moving from 16 to 19, note the increase. It's doubled in that 3 years. Will that trajectory continue? Well, the projection for 2022, which is only next year, it was only 4 months away, is some 7.5 million people will become gig workers by the end of 2022. Gig-based freelancers do actually contribute £20 million to the UK economy. 48% of gig workers in the UK also have a full-time job. So that gives you an indication how gig work often works. It works alongside a full-time job. And for 71.5% of them, gig work makes up less than half of their income. The male-female dynamic, 16.5% of the UK's male population That's the whole of the male population in the UK are gig workers. That compares with 14.1% of the UK's female population. 31.5% of UK's gig workers are aged 16 to 24, while some 16.4% are aged 25 to 34. So it's important to recognise that although gig work does actually extend across all age groups, it's driven primarily by the younger generation. 74% of gig workers who work full-time and see their work as significant indicated in the survey that they were satisfied with the situation. Yes, they were motivated and satisfied by the situation, although that tapers down to 48% for those operating more casually as gig workers, which we would call occasional work. Okay, next slide then, please, Ian. So on this slide, I've asked two questions. How did the gig worker emerge, and what are the reasons for going gig? You like that phrase? Yeah, going gig. It's good, isn't it? Although there's always been some sort of gig working, really going back into not just the last century, but the century before, although it wouldn't have been called gig, it really emerged as a phenomenon from the 2008 financial crisis. For some, it was the decision of choice of independence, that they didn't want to be dependent on jobs where they could be made redundant. So choice of independence, they wanted to be captain of their own ship, as we say. And for others, a choice of necessity, just reluctantly, out of redundancy, at the time, they chose to go down the gig route. The single most widely reported motivation for wanting to work as a gig worker is to introduce flexibility into your life. And the reason for wanting to go flexible are many. It could be you're caring for a family member. It could be you're a student wanting flexible work alongside your studies. It could be you're an individual wanting greater control over how you spend your time. The Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Report of February 18 reports 6 key reasons for an individual choosing to work in the gig economy. A belief that the gig economy is the future of work. Okay, I've got a slide on that later, the end of the employment era. Or is it? We will question and explore. An attempt to pursue a dream job, fulfilling your dream. Maybe you want to be a writer, and so you have other jobs to keep you going while you're building up your profile as an author within the reading community. An opportunity to earn additional income while pursuing a specific goal. An opportunity to gain work experience. That's what university students are encouraged to do these days. When they graduate, whatever you can get, just get experience. Okay. A desire for working conditions better suited to your own health condition. Whether it be physical health or mental health. You might not want to work in a large company because you experience some form of claustrophobia, for example. Or it might be that you're physically disabled and you need to work from home because you simply can't move around. You're bound in a wheelchair, but your mind is active and you're ambitious and you can work at your desk and at your computer. And a determination to transition to a positive experience from redundancy. I love that one. That a lot of people see redundancy as a negative aspect of their lives, but the gig worker will take redundancy and say, I'm going to turn my life around. I'm going to make sure that I make myself indispensable to my customers and to my clients. Good. Right. Let's go on to the next slide. Right. The end of the employment era. Not really, but it is interesting to explore. There's a number of interesting books over the last 30, 40 years that have explored this idea. James Robertson was an interesting book I read on this subject. It's come out in various publications. I think firstly in 78. I think the last one was about 20, maybe 15 years ago. It's called The Sane Alternative, The Choice of Futures. It heralds a transition away from the consumer economy into what is known as the conserver economy, with higher expectations for personal fulfillment, not necessarily equating to material acquisition and accumulation. And the characteristic of this new economy, this conserver economy, is spending less based on a new lifestyle, which doesn't require the previous spending and consumption levels of previously. I take from this concept and I put it into the domain for discussion today, that the key lesson to learn from this particular book is that the business psychology of employees, maybe all people today in 21, is dramatically different from that of previous generations. That might sound a very simplistic distillation, but that's my take, and that's what I'm sharing with you today, my take on the gig economy and how it connects with employee share schemes. There's loads written about the gig economy, but there's virtually nothing written about the connection between the gig economy and employee share schemes. So the employee share ownership ethic, that is both a response to and a facilitator of the changing expectations within society. It operates best, employee share ownership operates best when there's a structure of compatible human resource policies operating alongside it, encouraging individuals as employees within a company to develop creative, motivated, productive, entrepreneurial type mindsets. Ironically, it's those type of individuals who find a home in the gig economy as well. Maybe we want them in both places. Maybe we want them in the company as people with an entrepreneurial mindset operating within the employing company, the progressive employing company, and we also want them operating as gig workers, so that there's a nice fusion and chemistry between the two groups as they service the company. Let's go to the next slide. So, challenges of introducing share schemes to the gig workers. I've got 4 key questions here. First question is, what about available shares? Are there available shares? The shares are normally rationed to a particular percentage of the share capital, say 10% max really in a quoted company, up to anything really, I suppose, in a private company, depending on the will of the board of directors. But does that raise a problem? My answer is that yes, the decision has to be made on a balance of share allocation to employees compared with share allocation to gig workers. That decision, this is really crucial, that decision must always be driven by the expectations of contribution to productivity through involvement in the share scheme. As I always say, we don't want our share scheme simply to be a pretty figurine sitting on the mantelpiece like my pots behind me. No, we want it to have a utility purpose that serves the productivity of the business and the developing growth and value. If headroom on available shares does pose a problem, then possibly we use a phantom share option scheme, which is essentially a deferred bonus scheme, not linked to shares. That will meet the requirements, and I've got proven evidence through my own case file that can be an effective motivator. Question 2, gig workers do not conform to a homogeneous model. You know, it's not like Japan. 98% of people living in Japan are Japanese ethnic. Nothing like that at all. I just use that as a throwaway illustration. There's a wide variety of life aspirations, a wide variety of work preferences within the gig community. So how does the company design a share scheme to be suitable for all of them? Yes? Answer. This is the answer. Okay, this is what I found to be the answer. The share scheme structure for the gig worker must be very simple, exceedingly simple. And maybe we can learn lessons there for the employee community as well. Keep it as simple as possible, based upon direct communication of the simple message. Yeah? Always remember that. Direct communication of the simple message always wins the day. Let's go on to question 3, which is on the next slide. Gig workers are not subject to company training programs, performance management procedures, or internal decision-making committees. So how can the sister policies to employee share ownership, which make employee share ownership work, you know, the participation type subjects, the involvement type subjects for employees, how can you then implement a gig worker share ownership work type arrangement for the gig worker? Well, the answer is this. Okay, it's true that a successful employee share ownership implementation works best alongside, you know, its friendly policies, performance management, decision taking, training programs, whatever they might be. All the research in the UK and all the research in the US supports that position unanimously. But look, the sister policies that remain for the gig workers are 1, profit sharing. I'm going to say a little bit more about that on the subsequent slide, but also corporate communications. And when you actually share the corporate communications between both employees and gig workers alike at the same meeting, that can act as a very, very powerful unifier behind the company's vision. Let's go to question 4, next slide. So gig workers and employees can be easily categorized as separate groups of workers. You know, there are people who categorize groups or categorize people into groups. I think that's an awful thing to do, but it is an instinct which often prevails in a corporate environment. So how can the attractions of employment be preserved if gig workers have share schemes which have previously been the privileged preserve of the employed workforce? And the employee or the group of employees is sitting there or standing there saying, look, we're the employees of the company. It's our company, not theirs. Awful attitude. And we want to try and dissuade people from ever thinking like that. Well, this is my answer. The employment attractions of pension schemes, holiday pay, sick pay remain for the employees, together with a perceived safety, at least it's perceived, a perceived safety in that employment and the sense of belonging to an entity larger than themselves that they believe mitigates against risk that's associated with self-employment. Whether or not that's a mirage, we could debate that till kingdom come, because there is such a thing as redundancy. The downside of the perceived categorization is the development of a defensive form of protectionism. Protectionism can often form in a big corporate environment. It can be departmental protectionism. It can be protectionism that's geared to loyalty to a director. But, you know, there is such a thing as employee protectionism against the gig worker community. And the senior management of the company must be aware of that, because the company must always guard against any form of protectionism. It's always a negative. It's always a defensive negative. And when it appears within its ranks, well, its effects can be corrosive and potentially, if left unchecked, and I have seen this in a company, threaten the very existence of the company. So let's bring the gig workers and the employees together. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Understanding the gig worker's mindset and the approach to work. So the gig worker is typically a really motivated, energetic individual. They've mastered in varying degrees, depending on the individual, the integration, as I call it, when I write about these things, it's necessary to run a one-person, one-owned business. You know, the one-person, one-owned business has to do everything. They have to do sales, they have to do marketing, they have to do production, they have to do human resource management if they've got people working for them. I suppose then they wouldn't be one man, they might be two men or two women or whatever it might be. I call it the Candyman can. Yeah, and some of you may have written my piece I wrote years ago called the Candyman can. It's like the hot dog man can as well. You know, they do everything when they're selling their hot dogs or selling their candy outside the sports arena or the cinema or the movie theater, whatever. Okay, they solve their own problems, they manage their own business finances. If the gig worker is running the business through a small company, then the argument can be that they have their own share scheme through their own share capital. So we should be encouraging them and doing everything we can to support them in building their little company, strengthening their share capital, and strengthening their capacity to withdraw funds to invest. And that's really where the profit share dynamic comes in, to actually feed into gig workers' profit share. That might be a better alternative than a share scheme in certain circumstances. So the motivation for the gig worker is to grow the value of the company, invest, build their personal freedom. And in most cases, a profit sharing scheme can fit the bill. And it solves that problem, doesn't it, of the rationing of shares. The gig worker's energy and motivation is usually harnessed to an efficiency, to a discipline, to get the job done rather than to serve the time. Remember those definitions. It's not time served, it's tax accomplished. And that's where this principle comes from. It's harnessed to an efficiency and a discipline to get the job done. The gig worker is an entrepreneur. And listen to this. This is a really important point. And I've seen this on many occasions. Respect shown by the company's senior management to the gig worker for taking the initiative to become an entrepreneur is a really powerful element to bind that gig worker to the company. So I'm looking at share schemes for the gig worker, yes, but I'm looking at other things as well. So let's go on to this next slide, Ian. When will a share scheme be suitable for a gig worker? So this is my terminology, David Craddock terminology. I've got a piece coming out in Chartered One at the I think it's at the end of next month actually, on gig workers, and I divide these definitions for that. Is the gig worker you're looking at, is he or she a customer focused gig worker or a supplier focused gig worker? What do we mean by the terms? Again, let's define the terms, so important in this subject. So by customer base, we mean that the gig worker is servicing or serving a multiplicity of customers from the base of his or her own operation, maybe from their home. Okay, for example, the gig worker set up a self-employed business. I've got a friend who does this. Set up a self-employed business providing bookkeeping, accounting service from home, primarily on a virtual basis. The gig worker does not expect to be involved in a share scheme with those customers, yeah? Although in certain circumstances, this type of worker might be invited to participate, but not usual. But what about the supplier-focused gig worker? The supplier-focused gig worker, what I mean by that is the gig worker focused and dependent on one major supplier. So this is the Deliveroo type person or the Uber type person. In those circumstances, there's a propensity for a natural sense of identification with the one supplier company, thereby potentially making some form of share scheme a natural fit. Okay, and they're the examples. What are the examples? Well, they're quoted companies for one thing, and therefore there's a daily public display of their share movement. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, the purpose of an employee share scheme, how does it fit with the purpose of what we might call a worker share scheme, which would embrace gig workers? And it might be that come the day, and I think there will come the day, you know, and I'm here advocating it, when an employee share scheme becomes a worker share scheme, yes, covering not just employed persons, but self-employed persons who have a natural fit identifying with the company. So all the UK and UK research identifies these three key reasons for introducing employee share scheme: identification and involvement of employees, motivation and incentive of employees, and retention and recruitment of employees. And in the light of the analysis provided by this presentation, I ask the question, how do these three reasons align with the introduction of a share scheme for gig workers who are not employees? The answer is potentially complicated, but you know, this is a Bamba Gascoigne, Jeremy Paxman University Challenge started for 10. For the supplier-focused gig worker, yes, a real possibility. That's the sort of person attached to Uber or Deliveroo or one of those type of companies. If it's customer-focused gig worker, then yes, if part of the integral team, let's say if they're part of the key management team, for example, you might want to align them with the company through a share scheme. These next two slides are about tax. Services might be provided through a service company. If so, then the shares could actually be treated as employment-related securities, even though they're not an employee of the dominant primary company, the company with which they have the primary relationship to provide the service. But because they're operating through their own service company, it could be that their shares are classed as employment-related securities and taxed as such, although there are some quite useful tax planning techniques around that. And then this next slide, if they're not working as a service company, next slide, Ian, they're working in a self-employed status. And the key there is to take title to the shares as early as possible so that you can get into the capital gains tax regime. As long as it's an option, any gain arising on the option will be treated as part of business profits. But we want to get ownership of the shares into the hands of the people as early as possible, so that as much as possible of the gain can fall into the capital gains tax regime, which of course is under current legislation, and we hope that's not going to change, less punitive. With them owning the shares, there should always be forfeiture provisions within the Articles of Association which require them to forfeit in the event of leaving. So that's my presentation. 29 minutes past. How's that going then, Ian? Is that okay? And that's something about me and what we do to our business, David Craddock Consultancy Services. Do feel free to let us know if we can help you. Thank you.
You're always good at sticking to time, David, and I appreciate that. Makes my job a lot easier. So thank you very much, David. We've now got time for some questions and answers.
Yeah.
But actually, I would like to ask a question that's very much on my mind initially, yeah. If I may presume upon everybody, which is the notion of why are we doing all of this? And one of the reasons that many of us as commercial companies are keen on employee or keen on share ownership arrangements is because we believe that it binds people in, that it helps with productivity, it helps with loyalty, and things like that. So one of the things I was wondering, David, is do you have any examples where you have experience of seeing how this sort of arrangement for non-employees, for associates or for gig workers, as we're now calling them, actually delivers results for the companies that have put these schemes in place?
Yes, in smaller companies, not in a quoted company, I have to say, but in quoted companies, yes. Sorry, in unquoted companies, yes, where there could be anything from 5 to 10 self-employed individuals. We've worked out through our practice here ways in which you can actually do that and be consistent with the laws and not have to produce a prospectus, and make sure that you're compliant with the regulated activities and the financial services. There are various exemptions that you tap into, which are different from the exemptions that you tap into for the employee scheme. And the key is, and I reiterate it, the simple message directly communicated.
Okay. Thank you for that, David. We have a brace of questions, I should call it, from Helen Hopkins, and they're not they're slightly different subjects, but I will put both of them together. Firstly, she wants to know whether you're just talking about distribution of profits, or are you talking about actual shares for gig workers? And then she goes on to ask, which is why I think the questions are slightly related, to sort of help with her and perhaps our understanding of what you're saying. If a share plan was considered to be an employment-related security for gig workers, would the company need to include share allocations and events within the company tax return? So it's just trying to understand mechanistically, can this actually work as a share allocation arrangement with gig workers, and to some extent how that might work?
So the Form 42 electronic equivalent is purely for employees and directors. It does include directors, even if they're not employees. It doesn't include self-employed individuals who are not directors, but if they're operating through their own service company, yes, remember the penultimate slide of my presentation, then they will almost certainly have to make a return through their own service company of the Form 42 electronic equivalent, because they will be deemed to have received those shares, even though from another company, by virtue of being employed by their service company. That's the technical point there. Okay. The position about the first question that Helen asked, I am advocating, as I always advocate with regard to employee motivation, flexibility. Be flexible as to what you believe works within your company. If a share scheme works, working with real shares, then yes, go for share scheme. It might be that profit sharing is the better alternative. Okay, always supported by whatever human resource activity you consider to be appropriate. So yes, it's difficult to put them through training programs, although we have got a client that puts self-employed people through training programs, but unusual, and unusual for them to have performance management. I don't know of any company, any client companies of ours where there are self-employed people who have performance management. But yes, share schemes if appropriate, profit sharing if appropriate. My own take is that gig workers do value profit sharing because it enables them to build up their own independent pension pot, an investment pot, independent of any company, any of their customer companies. Yeah, I know there's also the soft factors as well. And one of the soft factors I put in was this really, which was the senior management of the company they're serving, recognizing their initiative to set up as a gig worker, recognizing their entrepreneurial instinct. Okay, my finding is that gig workers are often very proud of the fact that they've taken the risk, that they've gone out by themselves and they've exercised that entrepreneurial instinct to good effect, and that it is producing value in the lives of them and their families.
That's a really interesting answer. It does link to another question that's been in the back of my mind. So Helen hasn't asked this as a follow-up question, but I've got a funny feeling that she might, and that one or two other people in the audience might be thinking about this. Based on the answer you've just given, is there a risk that some of the activities that the company might do in order to bring gig workers into the share arrangements, or even the profit share, equity share arrangements or profit share arrangements, is there a risk that those activities might invalidate the gig worker's non-employment status? And how do you make sure that you don't do that?
Not really, no. In tax law, we have what are called the aggregate of factors. The aggregate of factors identify factors which contribute to the status of employment. And the involvement in a specifically non-employee share scheme by itself would not invalidate employment status.
But can you think of some of the activities that you might do around these things would invalidate it or might invalidate it?
Well, if you're also, well, if you're paying them on PYE, that's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? But you know, if you're bringing them into a company pension scheme, which they probably have to be on PY anyway to have that. But you know, if you're giving them holiday pay, for example, or if you're scheduling out their year in order to give them the opportunity for holiday weeks supported by holiday pay, or if you're giving them some sort of sick pay, you know, I mean, clearly if they're not on POA, it wouldn't be the SSP arrangement, but if you're giving them some sort of sickness benefit. So it's the aggregate of factors principle, which is always applied. It's always applied. I remember very early on in my career preparing contracts for self-employed people and structuring those self-employed contracts in such a way that they wouldn't fall foul of the aggregate of factors which establish employment position. Hopefully that helps, Ian.
It does, I think. One more question from Susan, who I think is writing into us from the USA. How is a UK gig worker different from a US gig worker? And could the UK tax-approved tax-advantaged employee share schemes be used for gig workers?
Well, they're two very good questions again. We've got lots of great questions in this session, Ian. Well, let me answer the second one first because it's UK centric. The tax-approved tax advantage, as we now call them, it's the same thing, tax-approved tax advantage schemes, which is EMI, CSOP, SIP, and SAYE. In my view, they should be altered. It would have to be by legislation in order to accommodate gig workers, but under a very firm set of conditions. So it would have to be properly monitored, properly controlled by statute, thereby enabling companies to properly monitor and control who becomes a member of that scheme. But this gig economy, I mean, I showed you the numbers, the escalation, you know, double number from 16 to 19, and then, you know, that phenomenon we were looking for in 22. I think it has to come, that there will be a recognition of the importance of the gig worker, and provided they meet certain conditions, that they are actually brought into the remit of the tax-approved tax advantage schemes. The point Susan makes about the US, well, the gig economy is enormous in the US. There are, I think, about 50, I think it's probably now top 60 million Americans, which is what, something like 40. I mean, if the American workforce is 160 and there are 60 million Americans, it's somewhere around 40% of the American workforce involved in either full-time or part-time gig work activity. Why? I've thought a lot about this, and pre-COVID, I used to visit America 4 or 5 times a year. COVID has grounded me for the time being, but there you go, it'll come back.
And the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The point I want to make is that gig working is a manifestation or an expression of entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship has very, very powerful roots in the US, where you have a society which is built from bottom up. You know, the immigrants came in and they developed the land and they developed land sharing. I write about this in the ESOP Institute Certificate of Employee Share Ownership Studies papers. In the UK, historically, you know, societies developed from feudal down, but, you know, we've caught up a long way where there's initiative from all sorts of places in the economy. But the reason why it's so much more powerful in the US is because entrepreneurship is historically so much more prevalent and respected and honoured and powerful there. You know, you look to where America was, you know, a dirt track in Chicago in 1800, and look where Chicago is now, or Los Angeles, or New York. You know, it's not for an absence of entrepreneurship that they've got there. It's because they have truly embraced entrepreneurship and built these massive, powerful, profit-generating businesses.
Okay, I think it does. One final follow-up question from Helen. Have you seen examples of separate non-employee share schemes set up rather than making gig workers eligible for an existing scheme?
Well, yes. When we've introduced schemes for non-employees, we've copied the format of the scheme we've introduced for the employees, but with a completely different tax regime. Yeah, and that might be that we're copying a tax-approved tax advantage scheme, or alternatively, I mean, I did one in China some years ago, and actually this was for a major quoted company, which ultimately got taken over, and it was very, very, very powerful indeed. And that was actually a phantom share option scheme, just to illustrate the flexibility that you need to address here in meeting the need of the company. You know, going back to Helen's previous question, you know, am I just advocating profit share or share schemes? I'm advocating share schemes where it works using real shares, share schemes where it works using phantom type arrangements, profit sharing where that works. It's a question of being sensitive to the needs of the company and following in detail the results of the consultation that you have with the directors, and fine-tuning, refining, bespoking the arrangement appropriately, which is what we do through our business. You know, we provide a detailed consultancy arrangement.
That's brilliant. The very final question, I'm going to answer myself. Okay, in fact, the person who sent in the question answered it for himself. I'll let him remain anonymous, because he said, "Is it possible to have copies of the slides from today?" And they said, "Oops, I've just found them on the website." And in fact, my answer to that question is yes, they are up on the website, and in fact, the videos of the presentations go up on the website, and not just this one, but this is one of quite a lengthy series. I think this might be number 11.
Number 11, Ian. That's right. Yeah. Can I say? I just say I specifically create those slides in such a way that people can look back at them afterwards and understand the principles. But one thing I've found over my career is how frustrating it is to go to a presentation and you've got, you know, 5 points with 5 words. And you go back afterwards and you think, well, what was that point? Well, you know, I include the detail of my point so that you can go back and hopefully keep it in your mind's eye and apply it in your business.
Yeah, I mean, these slides are very helpful. So to that gentleman who says that he's interested in setting up such a scheme, I would recommend just have at least a skim of the other subjects that we've covered, because there might be some detail about the different types of employee share ownership schemes that might be suitable for you from those earlier webinars. I have 3 rounds of thank yous for today. There are some thank yous coming in fact, by in the questions box. So thank you for your thank yous, everybody. I would like once again to thank the sponsors. These are the ESOP Centre sponsors again. We're very grateful to you for your membership and for your forbearance, so that we can do all of these things, and indeed the FS Club generally, and all of these wonderful organisations who enable us to put on this series of webinars. I of course want to thank you, the audience, for coming along and for participating in this webinar. The question and answer session has been excellent today. Just before I do the third thank you, just to point out to everybody, not only are all the slides and videos up, there are all manner of resources on the website for ESOP Centre as a subject matter, but all of the subjects that we cover in the FS Club. There are FS Club bulletins on all manner of subjects. If you go to the website, you can subscribe to various of these, and jolly useful they are too. So thank you for listening. If you like our webinars in general, this is the list of webinars that are coming up next. The good news for all of you is that the subjects are many and varied. deforestation linked to sovereign bonds tomorrow. On Thursday, all-party parliamentary groups, which is a fascinating topic. Deception and truth analysis for investors on Monday. And a jolly subject for the following Thursday. This is how they tell me the world ends, with cyber weapons. The bad news for you, if the thought of cyber weapons isn't bad enough, is that just when you thought that you'd got shot of me, I'm afraid you've got me again at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, as I'm going to be hosting the all-party parliamentary groups discussion. But for today, the next thing to do and the final thing to do is to thank David. This is about the gig economy, so I'm still hopeful that I'm going to get a gig at some point. So I will thank him, because we can't give the round of applause that I know, technically speaking, is ringing out throughout the metaverse of our audience. I will musically thank you with your initials and D, C. That's D, C. Thank you very, very much, David. And thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
Thank you.